At 8:47 on a Wednesday evening in June, the doors of the Sala Clementina were closed and 43 cardinals sat facing Pope Leo XIV in a silence that already felt unusual. No agenda had circulated, no aides were present, no recorders had been allowed into the room, and the single microphone in front of the Pope had been deliberately left disconnected from any recording device. It was June 24th, 2026. 14 months after Leo had taken the chair of Peter, and for 14 months he had refused to answer one private question. Every interview had been deflected. Every careful inquiry had been stopped with a raised hand. Whatever had followed him from Lima, he had kept it locked behind discipline, silence, and the hard restraint of a man who knew memory could become evidence. That night, he removed his zoukdo and placed it carefully on the table beside him. Then he folded his hands, looked at the cardinals, and began speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. He told them he was about to reveal something he had sworn on his mother's grave he would never say aloud. No one moved. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not the small rustle of a cassage against a chair. One cardinal near the back would later describe the silence as physical, as if the air had been punched out of the room and gravity had changed direction. Then Pope Leo XIV began to speak about Lima, Peru, in 1989. Not as pope, not as a cardinal, not even as a bishop, but as Robert Francis Post, a 34-year-old Augustinian priest who had once been handed the truth by a 19-year-old seminarian and had told him to bury it. To understand what Pope Leo revealed that evening, the story had to leave Rome and return to Peru in 1989. Robert Francis Provost was not yet a pope, not a cardinal, and not a bishop. He was a 34-year-old Augustinian priest from Chicago who had left his mother Mildred, his family, and his country to serve in Lima, where poverty was immediate, violence was rising, and the church still stood as one of the few institutions people could reach. Peru in 1989 was a country at war with itself. The Shining Path insurgency had turned whole provinces into killing fields, and the terror did not stop at the doors of the church. In the highlands, religious workers disappeared. In the cities, parish buildings were bombed, and young Father Post was learning that service in that place was not an idea, it was a daily risk. He had been assigned to a small Augustinian community on the edge of Lima. The streets around him carried the pressure of a nation breaking under fear, poverty, and suspicion. Families came to the church not because it was comfortable, but because in many neighborhoods it was the last structure that still opened its doors. No seminary training had prepared him for that world. It had not prepared him for the violence outside parish walls, the exhaustion inside poor families, or the moral pressure that came when survival and faith collided in the same room. But what Pope Leo told the cardinals was not mainly about politics. And it was not about the insurgency. It was about one young man. He was 19 years old, a seminarian under Pio's spiritual direction for 8 months, intelligent, devout, and from a poor family, on the outskirts of Lima. His family had sacrificed heavily for his vocation, and they depended on the church's educational network for his younger siblings. They believed his priesthood could become their redemption. They believed the church would protect what they had entrusted to it. Then, one autumn evening in 1989, the young man came to Father Post with something that would change both their lives forever. The young man did not come to Father's post with a sacramental confession. He came with a personal crisis. For months, while serving as an assistant to a senior cleric in the diocese, he had been watching something he could no longer ignore. The cleric was a man of considerable authority and decades of service. He was respected, protected, and deeply connected inside the local church. But according to the young seminarian, he had been systematically manipulating vulnerable parishioners, not sexually. And Pope Leo would later make that distinction very clear before the cardinals. The abuse was spiritual and financial. Using the authority of the confessional, the cleric gathered deeply personal information from people who trusted him completely. He learned who had inherited money, who owned property, who feared poverty, and which families were emotionally dependent on the church. Then he used that knowledge to influence inheritances, direct property transfers, and pressure families into financial decisions that strengthened his network of influence. Elderly widows had signed over property. Young couples had been pushed into giving beyond their means with the quiet suggestion that spiritual consequences could follow if they refused. Over time, a web of dependency had formed around the cleric, one that looked like pastoral care from the outside, but functioned like control. The young seminarian had not come empty-handed. Over several months, he had copied letters, gathered financial records, and written down dates, names, and amounts. He spread the documents across the desk in Father Post's small office and explained what he had seen. Then he asked the question that Pope Leo would later say haunted him for 37 years. What should I do? Father Post looked at the documents spread across his desk. There were letters, financial records, handwritten notes, dates, names, and amounts carefully copied over months by a 19-year-old seminarian who had believed that bringing the truth to a priest would lead to justice. Instead of answering immediately, Post sat in silence because he already understood the scale of what lay before him. The senior cleric being accused was not an isolated parish priest with no protection. He was a powerful figure in the faves, a man with decades of service and relationships that reached deep into the local hierarchy. Post knew that the local bishop owed much of his position to the same network of influence surrounding the cleric. Even with documentation, there was no guarantee that an accusation would survive once it entered the machinery of the fasces. The country itself was already under enormous strain. Peru was fighting an insurgency. Resources were thin, and the church was trying to hold communities together in places where almost everything else had failed. A public scandal involving a senior cleric would explode through an already fragile institution, and the young seminarian would stand alone against men with authority, reputation, and power. Then another fear entered Post's mind. The seminarian's family depended heavily on the church. His younger siblings received educational support through Catholic programs, and his 12-year-old brother held a scholarship at an Augustinian school. If the young man came forward and the accusation failed, the consequences might not arrive through an official punishment. They could come through 1,000 quiet decisions that no decree would ever record. So, the 34-year-old priest made a calculation that he would later describe as the worst decision of his life. He told the young man that this was not his battle to fight. He said the system was too strong, that he was too young, and that he needed to protect himself and protect his family. Then he told him to destroy the documents and say nothing. For a long moment, the seminarian simply looked at him. Decades later, Pope Leo would tell the Cardinals that he still remembered that expression. It was not anger. It was something worse. It was the look of a young man realizing that the person he trusted had chosen the safety of the institution over the truth placed in front of him. The seminarian gathered the papers from the desk one by one. He did not destroy them that night, and he never raised the matter with Father Provost again. Justice never came. The senior cleric continued in his position for another decade, perhaps longer, while the same families remained exposed to the same quiet machinery of influence. Property moved, money moved, pressure moved, and the institution around him found ways to keep functioning as though nothing had been placed on a young seminarian's conscience. 6 months later, the young man left the seminary. Pope Leo would tell the Cardinals that he did not leave because of the corruption alone. He left because something had broken in him when the church told him silence was wisdom. He eventually left Lima and disappeared from Post's life completely. In 37 years, Post never saw his face again, never learned where he had gone, and never had the chance to tell him that he had been right. The silence he had advised became a wall neither man crossed. Standing before the 43 Cardinals in 2026, Pope Leo did not soften what that meant. The young man had come to him with truth in his hands, and he had told him to set it down. In that moment, he said, he had become the very thing the young man was trying to report, a man using authority to protect a system instead of a person. For 37 years, Robert Provost carried that evening in Lima without speaking of it publicly. He carried it through every assignment that followed, through the years when he became a bishop, then a cardinal, and eventually the man who stood on the balcony of St. Peter's as Pope Leo XIV. Every title changed the world around him. None of them erased the face of the young man who had asked him what to do. Then, 3 weeks before the meeting in the Sala Clementina, a letter arrived. It did not come through the Secretariat of State, the diplomatic pouch, or any official Vatican channel. It came through the internal mail of the Augustinian order, handwritten in Spanish, on simple paper, from a woman in Trujillo, Peru. She identified herself as the sister of the young man. Her brother had died in March from cancer. He was 60 years old, had lived a quiet life after leaving the seminary, had married, raised 2 children, and worked as a teacher in public schools. He had never returned to the church. He had never taken communion again. But he had told his sister everything: the documents, the senior cleric, the corruption, and the priest, who had told him to be silent. The sister was not writing to demand money, punishment, or public humiliation. She was not writing like an accuser. She was carrying a message her brother had not been able to deliver himself. Pope Leo read that message aloud to the Cardinals. His voice broke for the first time when he reached the line that had crossed an ocean in 37 years. My brother said you were kind, that you were afraid, and that he forgave you 20 years ago. Pope Leo set the letter down on the table beside his zucchetto. For a moment he pressed his fingers against his eyes, not long enough to lose control, but long enough for the Cardinals to understand that the sentence had reached somewhere deeper than memory. Then he straightened and explained why he had brought them into the room. Forgiveness received in private, he told them, was a gift. But confession kept private by a man holding supreme authority was a privilege, and he was no longer entitled to that privilege. Not in that chair, not with that responsibility, not while asking the church to stop hiding what it had protected for generations. He said he could have read the letter alone in his chapel, wept, prayed for the young man's soul, and never spoken of it again. No one would have known. No one would have asked. But when he read that the young man had forgiven him 20 years earlier, he did not feel relief. He felt rage at himself, because the man had carried forgiveness for him, while Post had never sought him out, never returned to Lima to face him, and never asked for mercy from the person he had failed. He had risen through the church while the young man carried a silence that had never belonged to him. That was why he was speaking. The young man had died holding a secret that was not his to hold. Pope Leo had told him silence was wisdom, and the young man had carried that silence for almost 4 decades until it reached Rome in his sister's handwriting. Then Pope Leo told the cardinals why this confession stood at the center of his pontificate. Every reform he had ordered since taking the chair of Peter, every commission on financial accountability, every speech about transparency, and every demand that the church stop hiding had come from that room in Lima. It came from 1989 from a 34-year-old priest who had not been brave when a 19-year-old seminarian came to him with truth in his hands. He did not describe himself as courageous. He did not dress the memory in the language of destiny or moral strength. He said he was reforming the church because he had once failed to do the right thing when it mattered most. The cardinals sat motionless as his voice hardened. "I am not reforming the church because I am brave," he said. "I am reforming it because I was not brave when it mattered most." The words did not sound like a defense. They sounded like a sentence he had already passed on himself. Every day he sat in that chair, he told them, was a day he tried to become the priest that young man deserved to find when he walked into his office with the truth. That was the origin of his insistence on accountability. Not theory, not image, not institutional strategy alone, but personal penance carried into supreme authority. Then he placed the burden back on the men in front of him. If any of them believed this failure disqualified him, if any believed a pope who once counseled silence about corruption could not now demand transparency about corruption, they had to say it there in that room to his face. He would not carry silence the way the young man had carried it. He would not die holding silence in his hands and calling it wisdom. No one answered. For nearly a full minute, 43 cardinals sat in absolute stillness while the weight of what Leo had revealed settled over the Sala Clementina. The confession had not weakened the room. It had changed the terms of power inside it. Then Cardinal Peter Turkin stood slowly from his chair. He was a veteran Ghanaian cardinal, a man who had served under 3 popes and understood Vatican politics as well as almost anyone alive. He did not speak. He simply inclined his head toward Pope Leo in a gesture that was not quite a bow and not quite a nod. Then he sat back down. One by one, other cardinals followed. Not all of them, but nearly 30 of the 43 rose in silence and made the same small gesture. There was no applause. There was no absolution. There was not even full agreement because some men remained seated with unreadable faces. But something had happened that could not be reversed. A pope had stood before them, confessed the failure beneath his reforms, and forced every man in the room to understand that the demand for transparency now began with him. Leo picked up his zucto from the table and placed it back on his head with both hands. He adjusted it once, looked at the cardinals, and said only that he had said what needed to be said. Then he turned and walked out of the Sala Clementina alone. He moved through the long corridor outside the Sala Clementina with no private secretary behind him and no aide carrying a schedule. The frescoed ceiling passed above him. The Swiss guards stood at attention near the heavy doors, and none of them knew what had just happened inside the room they had been guarding. Leo continued alone toward the private elevator that would carry him back to the Dosanct. What happened next is known only through fragments. That evening, the Pope did not eat dinner. His meal was prepared and brought to the small dining area on his floor, but it was returned untouched. He went directly to the private chapel on the 2nd floor of the residence. A staff member later noticed that the light beneath the chapel door remained on until well past midnight. Another said there was no sound from inside. No prayer spoken aloud, no footsteps, no movement that could be heard from the corridor, only silence and light. The following morning, Thursday, June 25th, Pope Leo appeared at his usual 7 Mass in the chapel of Santa Marta. Those present said he looked different. One monsieur used the word unburdened as if something heavy had finally been set down and the body was still learning how to stand without it. Another observer described it more simply during the homily. The Pope smiled. Not a formal smile. Not the controlled expression of a man aware that eyes were on him, but a full and unguarded smile that those who saw him daily almost never witnessed during liturgy. His homily was brief. He spoke about mercy and about the difference between forgiveness received and forgiveness lived. He did not mention the meeting from the night before because he did not need to. Everyone close enough to see his face understood that something had changed. No announcement followed the Wednesday meeting. There was no press conference, no official Vatican statement, and no communication from the Holy See press office. The Vatican's daily bulletin for June 25th mentioned only routine meetings and a noon audience with a delegation from the Philippines. But silence in the Vatican is never truly silent. Word moved through the corridors of the Apostolic Palace the way water moves through ancient stones slowly and inevitably. By Thursday afternoon, senior officials in at least 3 dicasteries knew something extraordinary had happened behind closed doors. They did not know every detail. They knew only that Pope Leo had spoken to the cardinals about something deeply personal and that the mood inside the institution had shifted. A veteran journalist accredited to the Holy See Press Room later noted that 3 cardinals who normally lunched separately were seen at the same table in the Vatican cafeteria, speaking quietly. By Friday morning, June 26th, the Pope's published schedule showed a new entry that had not been there the previous week. It was a private meeting with the prefect of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. According to 2 sources with knowledge of the agenda, the subject was the expansion of existing accountability commissions to include historical cases previously classified as resolved or closed. The scope mattered. These were not only recent cases, they included files from decades past, cases involving financial manipulation in cases across Latin America, and matters that had been placed into administrative silence long enough for many inside the church to assume they were finished. 3 cardinals who had attended the Wednesday meeting also requested private audiences with Leo. The nature of those requests was not publicly known, but one source close to the situation described them as responses. They were men moved to bring forward their own stories, their own failures, and their own silences. The young man from Lima still had no public name. His sister's letter remained private correspondence, and the senior cleric Leo described was not named in the room. But 43 cardinals now carried the knowledge that the Pope, demanding accountability, had first demanded it of himself. The reforms reshaping the church were no longer abstract policy. They were personal pendants placed into institutional motion. Every meeting after that would happen, under a new pressure, because the men across from Leo now knew the wound beneath the words. Late on Thursday evening, Rome settled into its humid summer quiet, while the consequences of the Sala Clementina meeting continued moving beneath the surface. A Vatican photographer with access to the upper floors of the Doma Sancta captured an image that was never officially released. It showed Pope Leo XIV alone on the upper terrace, facing east toward the dome of the basilica, his hands resting on the iron railing as the city lights spread below him. He stood there for a long time. His white classic caught the last light, and his face was turned slightly upward toward something no camera could capture. The photographer eventually withdrew without announcing himself, unsure whether the Pope had noticed him or simply no longer cared who was watching. The next morning, someone asked Leo's private secretary how the Pope had slept. The secretary paused before answering. Then he said quietly that Leo had slept better than he had in 14 months. The young man from Lima would likely never have a public name. His sister's letter would remain private, and the church would never fully know the cost of the silence he carried for almost 4 decades. But that silence had reached Rome, crossed a closed room of 43 cardinals, and forced a pope to say what power usually hides. Pope Leo had not revealed his past to free himself from responsibility. He had revealed it because responsibility had finally become impossible to separate from truth. The boy who once walked into a small office in Lima with documents in his hands had become the reason a pope stood before the most powerful men in the Catholic Church and said he had failed. And from that night forward, every man who resisted Leo's demand for accountability knew exactly where that demand came from. It came from fear. It came from regret. It came from a wound that had waited 37 years to become reform. The next meeting had already been called. This time, there would be an agenda.